All right, everybody. So here we're going to try something out. I'm going to go through some of these lecture slides and provide kind of my commentary as we go through, similar to what you might see in a normal class if you're sitting in front of me. We're going to test it out. Feedback is welcome. I want to make this as useful as possible and make it still kind of interactive where you get a little more out of the class. So let's go for it. So the first question that you kind of have to answer in order to really begin understanding psychology is to just figure out what's the definition. And you're going to find tons of different definitions. Every single textbook has its own version of a definition for psychology. But they tend to boil down to the study of behavior. There are some historical things that happened during the development of psychology as a formal academic discipline where we started to roll in the study of the mind as well. We're going to touch on it a little bit in this lecture, something called the cognitive revolution. But really, behavior has always been a core component of the study of psychology. And when we talk about psychology, one thing that's always really important to remember is that it is the scientific study of human, not just human, but the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So psychologists study a lot of different things under that broad definition. Now, if you go back and look at the history of psychology, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint a specific instance of anything. When I would teach this in large classrooms of like 100, 200 students, I would spend some time going through a little bit of almost like a thought experiment. And what we ended up always getting down to was this idea that psychology probably began the moment that human beings were remotely self-aware and were able to try and take the perspective of someone else. So you can imagine a scenario where it's 100,000 years ago, we are hunter-gatherers, we're wandering around, there's primitive language. You see one of your, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's just an acquaintance that lives in your close-knit community, and they do something. Maybe it's something perplexing. And an immediate thought that I would argue is uniquely human is, why did that person do that? That core question is really the foundation of psychology. Why do people and other organisms, as we'll go on later in the semester, but why do people do the things they do? And we can organize that into behavior. And sometimes that behavior has cognitive precedent activity. So maybe, I think something and then I act on that thought. If we're trying to find like a specific time point in which we can just say psychology began at this time, really a lot of that happened in the 1800s, so the 19th century. There was a lot of activity on sensation and perception in like the 1830s to 1850s, but typically when you look in any kind of psychology textbook, they're going to say that psychology began, and this is important to remember, in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany, under the direction of Wilhelm Wundt, which is this right here. So the German, and I apologize, my terrible German accent, but the W's kind of make the V sound. So Wundt is often credited as the father of psychology. Now, please remember that although we're saying this out of convenience, that Wundt was the person who really started it, he was just the most recent in a long line of people who were doing similar work. The thing that Wundt did that kind of sets him apart is he put a name on it, and he made it, he just said, okay, psychology is a thing, we're different from philosophy, we're using this specific methodology that was derived from physiology research, so medical research that was going on at the time, and psychology is a thing, it's unique. So he said that he made a lot of effort to make psychology its own unique discipline, and because of that, I think we attribute some of that to him. His brand of psychology was something called structuralism. So you kind of have to think about what other things were going on at the time in science. We were taking this very reductionist approach to everything. We were trying to break down every aspect of the natural world into its fundamental pieces, its smallest pieces. Think of like the atom, in physics, or think of the periodic table in chemistry. Those are all things that are happening kind of around the same time that Wundt is developing his ideas. And so he was inspired by that and took a similar approach to studying human thought and human behavior. So the entire focus, and I'm simplifying here, but for the purpose of this class, the focus of structuralism was to break down all of our conscious experience to its fundamental pieces, to its fundamental structures. And he did that through something he called introspection. Now, it's important to remember here that when Wundt and his colleagues were talking about introspection, it's not quite the same as how we use introspection now. When we say introspection, we're thinking, okay, I'm reflecting on my own thoughts a little bit. I'm reflecting on my own actions. It's kind of that, but it's a very structured and systematic way of thinking about your experience. So the way I would often describe this in class is, let's say that I've got an apple out on a table, and I look at that apple and I try to perceive that apple in all of its appleness. But the process of introspection requires that as I'm looking at that apple, I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about that apple. And through this very systematic and rigorous process, I might come down to some core concepts. For instance, when I look at an apple, maybe I'm thinking about the color red. Maybe red triggers this additional memory of fire trucks. Maybe fire trucks make me think of fire, and I have this perception of fire. And then I go, okay, well, that doesn't fit with an apple. So then I come back to, okay, what else is it? Maybe I can imagine what an apple tastes like, or I think of apple juice, and I think of childhood, and I think of riding a tricycle and skinning my knee. Okay, now I've stopped because I've gone too far. What else is it? Maybe the shine of an apple. So you're really thinking about what an apple is and how each one of those sensory, those perceptions trigger some memory pathway and all the pieces that go to it. And I realize this is really confusing, and it is. It's just kind of inherently a slippery concept, but the purpose of all of this is trying to boil structures, or boil the human mental experience down to its core structures, similar to what you would do in the periodic table. You can imagine a periodic table of the mind. Now, later on, someone came along by the name of William James, and William James is a very fascinating person, and he had this idea of something called functionalism right here. His approach was different than structuralism, whereas Wundt and his colleagues were interested in the structure of the mind. James was more interested in what's the function of all of these mental activities. He was heavily inspired by the work of people like Charles Darwin. What is the purpose of a rabbit having these long ears? Obviously those ears are kind of maladaptive because they draw attention to the rabbit from predators. So there has to be a benefit to having those ears. And there, of course, is. William James thought of human mental activity in the same way. When I have, think of any maybe common mental thing or thought that you might have. Let's say you do really poorly on an exam. Most people are going to feel bad about that. Okay, so you feel bad about doing poorly on an exam. William James wouldn't just say, okay, that's interesting. He would ask, why do we have that mental activity? It's predictable. We feel bad when we do poorly on an exam. What is the function of feeling bad? And then you might come to some answer like, well, feeling bad is uncomfortable. It's something we want to avoid. We are averse to feeling bad, just like we're averse to physical pain. We're talking about mental pain, mental anguish here. So if I'm averse to that, then maybe the purpose of feeling bad when you don't do well on something is to do well on it in the future. It's to guide us to being more productive. And that's kind of how I would approach it. Moving on to psychoanalytic theory. When we get into developmental psychology and personality psychology, we're going to talk a lot more about Sigmund Freud, who's probably the most well-known psychologist, if you want to call him that. If you just go out on the street and ask anyone, who's a psychologist, name one psychologist, most people are going to name Freud. Freud was a physician. He was a medical professional. And again, most of these people early on were not trained psychologists because psychology wasn't really a thing when they were going through school. Freud had very interesting and bizarre ideas, and he's trashed on a lot, and his ideas were kind of out there, and they're not really supported by any science anymore. But I think one thing we can take away from Freud is he had this grand, all-encompassing theory of human behavior and the development of it. And his contribution, which I think is well-founded and still continues to be relevant today, is the idea that a lot of our behavior, the source of that behavior, is kind of below the threshold of awareness. We're not really aware of why we do the things we do. Now, I'm going to skip over Gestalt psychology here. We're going to get more into that when we go over sensation and perception. And I'm going to wait to talk about humanism as well. But I want to touch on behaviorism just really quick, because it is one of the most prominent aspects of psychology that, although it's kind of out of vogue now, the core concepts are very well supported scientifically, and I would argue highly applicable to everything that, well, not everything, but a lot of the things that we do now in our own lives. And we're going to talk a lot more about that when we go over learning later on. But the basic idea of behaviorism is that we cannot study scientifically human mental processes. People like Watson and especially Skinner, who we're going to go over more, their thought was, although I believe I'm thinking, okay, I'm aware of my thoughts in my head, I can be sure that I have thoughts. I cannot be sure that any other person has thoughts. Now, as ridiculous as that might sound, if you kind of boiled it down to the base premises, it kind of makes sense, because I don't actually know what anyone's thinking. I can take your word. If I ask you while you're in the middle of some daydream, what were you thinking about? You can tell me. But that's based on assumptions, right? It's based on me believing that you're telling me the truth. It's also based on the assumption that you're aware of what you're thinking and that you can adequately describe it back to me. Those are, as we're going to learn through this course, pretty big assumptions. So their point with behaviorism was really not to just say, okay, human mental activity doesn't exist. But what they were saying is there's really a difficult time in evaluating it. So rather than spending all of our time, like people like Wundt and William James, trying to figure out what people are thinking, how's it structured, what's the function of it, let's just ignore all that. Let's focus on behavior. Behavior is something we can actually witness. So that was kind of the core part. And then they answered that by things like operant conditioning. Think about how you train your dog to do something. By classical conditioning, that's more of Pavlov's area. But basically through conditioning of behavior, which is a form of learning. So we're going to go over a lot of those things here in this course. But this is a really quick overview of what psychology is and some of the key pieces on the history of psychology.